truth, I tell you what, going live in any situation is full of potential problems, isn't it? So here I am. You do a week's worth of work to set yourself up for a stream to go live, only to find on the day, minutes before you go live, that so many of the different features involved can go fucking pear-shaped on you, can't they? Issues with streaming. So I've had two issues today. One of those issues is with the streaming software itself, which for some reason isn't recognizing files that it recognized yesterday. I don't know why. And the other issue is that YouTube, fucking YouTube. Sorry, YouTube, if you're listening, but you know, fucking hell, it's meant to be simple, but it really fucking isn't. You do everything they say that you should do. Now that's not working either. Oh my god, what the hell is going on here? Right, there we are. Okay, so we are finally here. We are finally live. Now, big shout out. Big, huge shout out. Last week we launched, or 2 weeks ago, we launched my Patreon page. And you can see on the bottom of the screen there, Tamara Lee, Kirsty Haigh, Dorothy Di Stefano and Wayne Groom. Thank you. 3 people who have gone to my Patreon page and become the very first patrons of the very first online theatre company, which is still obviously in its formative stages. Now, here we go. Our goal, our primary goal, $80 a month, if we to get a dedicated live streaming channel on Vimeo. It is a much more stable platform than YouTube. It is a much more user-friendly platform than YouTube. It doesn't have all that. YouTube, I did everything you asked. And as soon as I went to stream to you, you disappeared and you didn't work for some reason. And you didn't even give me a reason. You didn't even give me a reason. Let's get rid of you. Had enough of you. All right. Yeah, man, like, seriously, what the heck is going on here? Anyway. So you follow all their instructions, you follow all their things, you set up everything the way they want it to, and then for some reason it doesn't fucking work. Problems of live streaming. So that's our first target of our Patreon subscription, is that we are going to try and get, we are aiming to get a dedicated Vimeo channel that we can stream to. I'll show you what it might look like. Look, that's not what I wanted. As usual, I'm DJing here. DJing here, sorry, I gotta keep talking to you. DJing here, oh yeah, blah 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 blah. No, I've already done that. No, I've gotta log in. Oh my god. Even this is proving problematic today. Normally, oh my God, let's just forget about everything that's going pear-shaped again. Really. And we're going to talk today about conventional theatre. Now, before we go to understand, before we try and understand the complexities of live streaming theatre, I wanted to go back and talk with you about how conventional theatre and performance has been practiced for 4,000 years. This is the stuff that you see at the moment. This is the stuff you learn in Drama 101. Right? Greek theatre came along and created the amazing amphitheatre experience. And nothing much has really changed in terms of what theatre and performance is, cultural theatre and performance is in that time. And I wanted to talk to you today about how humans, how we use the physical space of a theatre environment to create the relationships and the meanings that are then communicated through it. What does that mean? Well, let's have a look at how things are set up. So you can see here, this is a classic picture of a Greek theatre. Yeah, let's try and pick this one here. Okay. Audience sits around here. Orchestra, or that's the performing area, the orchestra pit there, right? That's the circle where everyone stands. And you got your back space, your skene. Here it says scene. This picture gives you a little bit more detail again. So you can see that the physical landscape, and in terms of the Greek theatre, it was literally carved into the side of mountains. Yeah. The physical space has been broken up and organised into different sections for different people with different jobs to do. So we're at this point of categorising space, sorting out space. Not everyone is just moving around in space like on the street. We're bracketing out where and how people move and are allowed to move within the dedicated time of a show. So your audience enters and they all sit. Yep. Your actors are behind here. So we've already got a separation of space. These people and these people, they're separated by a physical building or a structure here. These people are allowed to walk onto this space here. They're allowed to go and talk. And behind here you've got different things going on as well. Yep, this all pretty much makes sense. I know it's pretty standard, but nothing much has changed in the 4,000 years that this has happened. Here's a modern stage. You can, well, the modern Greek, the Greek theatre, says here Greek theatre, floor plans, yep, Greek theatre setting. So you can see that essentially the same thing has happened. You can see over here, it's just reorganised and it's done in slightly different ways. You've got different levels of seating. In this environment here, you can see that, what is E? Sections of seating. F, seats of honour. Right, so so even within this group of people who have been bracketed out and separated from this group of people here, within that there is another group of people that are separated again. So we've got levels of hierarchy. And we've got levels of authority where people can be. Yep. These things have been patterned and reshaped over and over again. This is a Domain Theatre in New South Wales Art Gallery. And you can see from this diagram here, it follows the same principles. Here is the stage, here is the seating. Yep. You can also see, this is a good example because you can see how the flow of human traffic, as human traffic starts to flow through the space, it becomes segregated. You can imagine that out here is the foyer, or out here is the foyer. Well, I'm not quite sure what the foyer is, but beyond these walls here is the public space where people just mill and seethe, and people are people, and they all just mingle as they always do. Yeah? And then as they move through the space, they become separated from that public space, and they become something else. They become an audience member. The general public here become an audience member here. Now, in order to get through these doors, you need to have some sort of validation. You need to have a ticket. Yeah? Ticket is an economic transaction, and by making that transaction, it gives you a little piece of paper that gives you authority to enter this space. Piece of paper, economic transaction, pays for a piece of paper that gives you access to move from this public space into a more private space. Even though this is still sort of general admission, yeah, it is still isolated and separated and segregated from that. This is important things to remember when I get to other stuff later. Yeah. Theatre stages come in all shapes and forms. Obviously, we've gone back to our Greek theatre here. That's probably more your conventional proscenium arch space here. Even within a stage space, actors and performers and theatre makers have broken down the areas of space that have different names. So you are either stage centre or you are downstage left. You're not just on stage now, we've broken it down. And there are theories in performing about the relative dramatic power of standing in one of these. So a character stands down here and another character enters up here. Plays into ideas, again, of power and status. This is a traverse stage, so the stage is here and the audience sits on either side. The audience can watch them. Still though, principles are the same. You exist out here, you enter into the theatre space by virtue of a ticket, and you sit here. Audience is allowed to sit here, actors and performers are allowed to go here. This is a theatre in the round, same principle. It's just that going all the way around. This use of structure that separates the social identity of people and compartmentalizes it down and down and down and down and down into more and more narrow fields is replicated over and over and over and over again. And despite the fact that we're all probably brought up thinking, hello?
I just have to get a painting.
Oh. Oh.
Yeah.
Where was I? So, despite the fact that we are brought up thinking that the Greeks kind of laid the foundation for this kind of work, what's unique is that it's not. Well, what's interesting is that it's not unique to them. This one down here is a no theatre floor plan. Japanese no theatre. Now, these guys, the Greeks and the Japanese, weren't connected, separated by time and space and geography. And yet you can see the same principles apply. Okay, the stage setup might look different, but you can still see that same, essentially that same pattern of breaking down general populace into coordinated groups still exists. Audience would have been out here in the foyer. They come into the space and they are separated into different spaces. Here, the performers perform along this space here. This is the stage area, and in Japanese theatre there are also certain rules about characters and when they can enter and all that sort of stuff as well. So there are rules about who can be in what space. Again, this is probably all just... As theatres have evolved, they've become more and more complex. This one here, I mean, look how complicated that space is. You've got dressing room spaces, rehearsal spaces, you've got technical areas, you've got where lighting equipment, you've got, two lots of backstage here. You've got an audience, thrust stage, where the stage thrusts out and into the audience, but essentially the pattern doesn't change. Audiences enter, and as they enter through the various catacombs of the space, they are separated more and more and more into this hierarchy. Again, over and over, you see it. It's the same pattern over and over again. Performing Arts Centre, Harare. Look at this brilliant. Box office and kitchen, foyer, auditorium, stage, backstage, band room, instrument store, boys' toilet, girls' marimba room, ensemble room, practice room, assistant director's office. Like, we've taken this version here and just completely made it more and more complicated, separating and isolating people all the time. Yeah. Classic examples here. You can see this is a public parade, but it looks like the traverse stage here. Yep, it's basically the traverse stage here. So these ideas of stages and performing spaces can exist in open air spectacles, or they can exist in more private spaces. Again, this is Wembley Stadium. That's essentially a proscenium arch stage environment, and you can see quite clearly where this group of people are allowed to be and this group of people are allowed to be, and these group of people are there's fewer of them. They're more refined, they're more unique. This is the Globe Theatre in London. Again, same principles. Yep. The actual structures may look slightly different, but the essential pragmatics of the spaces are all the same. We're separating the performers from the audience. And in doing that separation of performing and audience, what we're doing is we're creating a status between performer and audience. Yeah. By herding people into one space, you say, you can be over here and this is what you're allowed to do. You can be over here and this is what you're allowed to do. And this goes on and on and on. This is the Kabuki Theatre, or the No Theatre I was telling you about before. I'm sorry if I've got the two things you can mixed up, but you can see the same principle: audience, performer. By virtue of separating space, we separate authority and autonomy about what people can and cannot do. Yeah. Now, this all feels like it's taken for granted. Again, street theatre. You can see, even with street theatre, crowds naturally form around the performer. Yep. Sometimes these spaces are defined by ropes. Sometimes, but what usually happens is that audiences kind of naturally know their position. They naturally know what they're allowed to do. They're not allowed to go onto the performing space. That's not what they're allowed to do. They must sit and watch. Only those people are performing, or only those people in street theatre, sometimes they invite audience members up. So there's an invitation for them to move from one space to the other. But that is at the discretion of the performer, and that's where the authority and the power happens between performer and audience member. Performer has authority because there are fewer of them, and they're allowed to be in that performance space. Audiences must stay out there and observe and watch voyeuristically. Yep. They're not being asked to be a part of it. Happens again and again and again. Now, these are, like I say, public street performances rather than stages that we've just been looking at, but you can see the pattern going over and over. Yeah. Now, this may all sound like, well, duh, And it is kind of, well, duh. And that's the interesting thing from an anthropologist's point of view, is that the things humans do ultimately become taken for granted, becomes assumed knowledge. Yep. It becomes so assumed we don't even think about it anymore. It's just like breathing. That's what has to happen. And that's why I'm going back over this, because it's really important if you want to understand more about how web theatre works and how live streaming performance works. The thing that I really discovered in the fieldwork is that I had to break down these assumed structures of place and space and who has authority were so inground. I had to break them down. I didn't even realise that I was so entrenched in these ways of thinking about performance. Okay. Now, this is a slightly different image in as much as these are churches and medieval churches, particularly. Now, church is unique. I mean, here's a good one here. Oh, that's a theatre again. Old church theatre, introduction to drama. Okay, let's look at this one. Now, you've probably been into churches that look like that. St Paul's in London looks like this. Most cathedrals look like this. And they replicate that performance thing that humans do. There becomes a space where privileged people with authority to speak stand in one space, and they project and communicate out to a general audience of people who sit and watch. There is a process usually to move from public space into this space where you can sit. But again, as an audience or a congregation in the church, you're not allowed to necessarily talk unless you're invited to talk and respond in some of the prayers and sermons and stuff. So you can see this pattern of performance. It replicates itself over and over again. If you've ever been to university, if you've ever been to a school and you've sat in a classroom, which I'm guessing most of you have, you will see the same thing. The person with authority to speak is isolated and sits up the front, or stands up the front, or in the middle, or in any other one of those configurations, and everyone else sits and observes. Theatre. The etymology of the word is a place for seeing. Yeah. Now, okay, we're going to get on to Van Gennep later. Van Gennep came up with this thing called a rite of passage, which is, and Turner, an anthropologist called Turner, picked up on that. Because what these two guys talked about, and I recognised, is that a rite of passage, just briefly, is moving from one social status to another. When Kate Middleton got married, before she went into the church, she was Kate Middleton. She went into the church. She went through a process and a wedding ceremony, a ritual, and then she came out of the church with a different social status as the Duchess of Whoop-de-Whoop, or whatever it is. I can't remember what it is. But that's the point. She went in as a commoner, she came out as a royal, and what happened in the middle was the rite of passage. In a nutshell, that's what happened, right? But it happened in that church. That church followed the same geography of a theatre, like we've just looked at. Churches with a priest at the head who is allowed to speak, has certain authority to be able to transform the identity of Kate from one to another. And that is why theatre, generally speaking, has this romantic notion in that it is transformative for people. You go to the theatre and your experience is transformed. Yep. You come out having had an experience that hopefully changes you in some way, makes you think something differently, makes you feel or empathise with a character who you might not have thought about before, and it can reconfigure you. So this guy called Victor Turner came along and noticed these observations, that there's this breakdown of space, geographic space, that facilitates these changes. Yeah. If you've got questions, tweet me. Hashtag Web Theatre is the one we're using, because I'm streaming to a couple of different places simultaneously. So if you want to ask me a question, you're probably best to tweet me at that, and it will pop up. Well, it should pop up. Why the hell isn't it popping up? Oh my God. One of those days. It really is. There we go. It's popped up now. One of those days. One of those weeks. You get them. Okay. Right. So we've gone through that. Humans exist on the planet. We all move around in space. And what we do when we want to perform, or we want to do a rite of passage or a ritual or something like that, we break down and we isolate and we categorize where humans are allowed to stand and what humans are allowed to speak. So there's this relationship of space and there's this relationship of authority. Yeah. But what is significant about the internet is that it is very different. Right? So what does the internet look like? Well, I typed that in, literally. What does the internet look like? And you've possibly seen these images before. There's a whole different ways of imagining what the internet looks like. This is a particularly interesting one. It's you can get that on a app, actually, on your phone. What does the internet look like? What is it called? I think I've still got it on my phone. Somewhere, can't find it for the moment. Internet map. There you go. Internet map. Can you see that? Right. That is what the world looks like. That's the intensity and the density of internet usage around the world. Different countries. There you are, over there. And there's also different ways you can see that as well. But generally speaking, we think of the internet as looking something like that. It's a bit of an organism. It's a universe. There's nodes of interrelationships. That's very important. The idea that there are nodes of interrelationships is like synapses in your brain, multiple different connecting points. Okay. Where am I going next? Okay, so online performance spaces. So if that's what the internet looks like, if that's how then how do we perform online? Well, the thing is, if you're online at all, you're performing, right? Now, let's take Instagram, for example, right? Instagram is somewhere that you create an identity with. As soon as you log on to something like Instagram or any social media platform, you start to create an identity for yourself. That's your name, your username, the image that you use, to identify yourself, the hashtags, the little lines. Do you want to use your name in a particular font? All of these things are incremental ways that you present your personality online. You think about it like you put your clothes on. How do you want to be seen to other people on this particular platform? Yeah. The thing is that you can have multiple presentations of that person. They can exist on multiple different formats. Instagram, Twitter, Tumblr, Snapchat. you don't have to be the same person on each platform. You can be a different person or a different aspect of yourself. I had a conversation with someone the other day about trolls and people who are abusive or misogynist on Instagram, for example. And you often hear that argument about, when people get online and they're anonymous, they sort of let themselves off the leash, or they don't, they wouldn't behave like that in real life or anything like. There is an argument to say that they're actually more authentic when they're being those people, because they feel untethered by the other social identities that they have in the world. They can just be, misogynistic prick 001 on Instagram, and that's, in some senses, that's more authentic, that little sliver of their personality. So what we can find is that with all of these social media platforms, we can compartmentalize aspects of our personality. In this, there was a reading I did a while ago of a group in New Guinea, I think it was, a tribe in New Guinea, and everyone in that tribe had like 6 different Facebook profiles, right? Because they compartmentalized their personality in each one. So this particular profile was political activism. This particular profile was all about family. This particular profile was all about their mistresses. And so they, you can see how they separated and they sliced up their personality to live independently on each different platform. Each different platform also interrelates with every other one. All right, classic example is if I go to... Have you ever seen something like this? Hootsuite. All right. Best way to manage your social media identity. It's literally... It is literally a platform. You pay for the privilege too. It is literally a platform. You can see there my videos, my streams, my tweets, all the rest of it. You can literally have all of the different social media identities on one screen, and you can operate them separately and individually, remote from each other. See if we can get mine up for you and have a look. Excuse I for a mo. Dashboard. Right. As an example, let me get this up for you. Hootsuite. Here we go. All right, have a look at this. Right, you can literally see, right, up the top here. Show the cursor so I can do this. Where'd you go? Where did you go? There it is. All right, you can literally see, right, up here, that you got your Twitter page. Move over here so I can see what I'm doing. Okay, so I've got my Twitter account here, right? My tweets, mentions, particular hashtags that I'm following. Yeah, is what I mean. If you want to tweet me, use that hashtag and I can see it. I've got my LinkedIn account, right? Now I've only got one up. But again, get rid of that. Again, you can see that there's, okay, LinkedIn. What is LinkedIn? LinkedIn is like professional dating. It's, well, yeah. So LinkedIn is business, it's professionalism, it's that kind of networking and all of that sort of stuff. Then you've got your Instagram. Instagram is obviously a visual medium. Yeah. You can break up and this is a scheduled post. It's not going to come, you won't see that on Instagram until 12 o'clock today. So I can break up my identity and I can post stuff. I can write and schedule. So I scheduled that like 2 days ago. So I wrote it 2 days ago, but I'm going to project my identity later in the future. Hasn't actually happened yet. So all of a sudden, because of the nature of the internet, because of the nature of these social media platforms, where you have to create a new identity almost every time that you get on, where you can schedule things into the future that haven't happened. You can identify yourself visually or textually. Twitter is obviously a text-driven kind of platform. Instagram more visual representation of who you are. So why do I say this? Because let's go back to here. All right, let's go back to here, or let's go back to any of these positions here where you've got public, exist here. Let's get rid of Oh, did I not transfer that? There it is. Okay. Hey. You can see, I'll go through that again. You can see you've got scheduled posts for Instagram there. Yeah. You got LinkedIn here. Different type of thing again. Twitter here. And you can follow different streams, and you can add different streams and that you can follow, different hashtags that you want to follow. Yeah. So all of a sudden, this idea that you are just a person in the world, you can actually compartmentalize and break down your identity into little slivers. You can operate them remotely. You can operate them on lots of different devices, computers, phones, tablets. You can be anywhere in the world. You can project your identity through time and space all over the place. He's a poet and he don't know it. Now, I go back to the original idea about performing space, where you are just a member of the public in the foyer of the State Theatre. That is who you are. You are all-encompassing who you are. You're not, when you're in the foyer of the State Theatre, you're not presenting the Twitter version of yourself or the Instagram version of yourself or the LinkedIn version of yourself. You are the whole package. You are then separated through an economic transaction to become a different person in this space, but you're still all of you. And you are all of you with a, now as an audience member, an obligation to just sit and listen to what someone else who has more authority has to say to you. Online, it doesn't work that way. Fundamentally, something has changed because we're not looking at one person. You're looking at me now, but I may have several different handles. I may have ghost handles that project different identities of myself. And because you go online, you're not just a member of the pub. You're not just a member of this. I hope you're following me because it is difficult to get your head around. Yep. Because of the nature of social media, because it requires you to input something from the moment you sign up to an account. You create your own identity, you input into it, and you are in charge of that. Because the nature of social media is communication, is dialogue with other people. The concept of doing a performance online changes because people expect to be able to talk and listen and communicate with you. All of theatre, all of film, and all of television is predicated on the idea that someone stands here, has the authority to speak to a group of people out there who don't. All of social media interaction online is predicated on the idea of dialogue. In fact, it doesn't work unless you're communicating or speaking. If you went onto any of these social media platforms and you didn't communicate and you just watched as a voyeur, then you are not, then the algorithm, as soon as you press a like on something, the algorithm recognizes that and it feeds you something else. It's based on communication. If you were to try creating an Instagram post, an Instagram profile, without giving any details about your likes or your interests, don't like anything, don't do anything, and see how the algorithm has a conniption because it doesn't know what to feed back to you. These things are designed for you to input. They're designed for communication. They're designed for you to input something in order for the system to input something back to you. Yeah. So when it comes to performing online, this is the fundamental difference. It took me a long time to get my head around, and that's why I'm doing these vlogcasts, A, to try and help other people out there who want to learn about it, but B, to try and work through it myself as I go back through this journey. So one of the things we discovered early on is that if you just perform something, and this is what I was getting back to last week, if you just capture and release a performance, you may as well be doing a film, because you're not interacting with the real people who are online. By virtue of the fact that if you're online, you want to communicate. I've got people watching at the moment. They're not talking to me. That's fine. But the difference is that you expect to be able to. You expect to have that choice. When you're sitting in this theatre here, you don't have a choice. You sit and watch. You can laugh and you can respond, but you don't have the choice. You don't have the option to communicate back to the actor speaking. In fact, if you did communicate back to the actor who was speaking, it would be disruptive. We've all, wouldn't it? Because we've all seen, where's my other image? It's not there. We've all seen, let me show you. We have all been a victim of this, haven't we? This look here. Who's ever been in a theatre and mentioned something or turned their phone on or whispered too loudly, and you get that social group, that social sort of demanding of behaviour, shaping your behaviour. Shh, quiet. And the glare. I love the glare. They got the glare down really well. Or if you're a performer and you've been on stage and there are people talking in the audience. In fact, there are stories now, you've probably heard them, of actors and performers coming out and roasting the audience for turning their phones on. In fact, I think there was a story in the West End where an audience member got up on stage and tried to plug there was a PowerPoint as part of the set, and they got up on stage and tried to plug their phone into the PowerPoint to charge their phone. Everyone sort of goes, oh, because again, these are examples of how we have been conditioned to think in this way about performing. But online, in a space that looks like this, where you're allowed to interact and you're required to interact. In fact, like I said, you are required to interact in order to make the internet work, these social media platforms work. If you don't, then it's a nothing. We're starting to see this crossover. And we have this relationship, audience performer relationship, power, control. No greater example of the ability to command a group of people like this. But online, it looks different. Over here is a picture of a Twitch channel, right? And it sort of breaks down what it's meant to look like. And you can see that it's not this environment. It's much more complex, much more multifaceted. It has much more input going on simultaneously. You've got the game being played. You've got the person playing the game. You've got a chat feed going on down here where the person playing the game is often responding to things that are going on in the chat feed. But at the same time, there are often conversations going on within the chat feed between different fans and followers that aren't related to this, aren't part of this conversation at all. Down here, you've got how many people are watching. That becomes an influential point. And down here, you've got subscribe buttons or donation buttons. People throw in tips like the buskers. Yeah. This is a photo down here of a team of gamers. So all these players here are on one team. They're all isolated individuals looking at their isolated interface on the computer, and yet they're all playing together. I love this photo. It's quite ironic that they're actually being put on a conventional stage where there's an audience watching them. But the reality is that this audience here could be tweeting them in this chat room here. And these people could be talking back to them via this channel here. One example I had from field work one day, we were struggling with this for a long time. And one day we decided that, we kept asking the audience, give us feedback, tweet me, comment me, ask me a question. And they didn't. And we thought, that kind of made our work fail, because what we were trying to do is set up scenarios, kind of like theatre improv, where the performance depended on contributions from the audience coming back to us. But the audience wasn't coming back with any contributions, so the performance failed. So I think a couple of weeks later we tried it again, and this time we just did a workshop. And we put the camera on, and we didn't bother. We knew they were there, but we didn't bother talking to them at all. And a post came up in the chat feed that said words to the effect of, "Why aren't you talking to us? That's why we come here, so you can communicate with us." So there was this demand and this expectation on behalf of the audience that they could talk with us. And they expected to be able to talk with us. And it was a failure of a performance if we didn't talk to them and invite them to be a part of the conversation. Very different to conventional theatre. So the other thing that happens in that relationship is that the audience demands the right and the opportunity. Like you watching right now, you kind of want the opportunity, and you demand and expect to be able to have the opportunity to tweet me and talk to me. But you don't have to do it. Bring the screen up. What do you mean by bring the screen? Oh, the screen. Okay, gotcha. Yep. You don't have to do it. So there was another example where we were streaming we were just streaming a cooking show. We were just cooking in the kitchen, and we were talking to our audience, and they weren't talking back, so we just kept talking. And I got to a point where I was looking for something. I was looking for a pair of scissors or something. I couldn't find it. And I was rummaging around. I went, oh, where is this pair of scissors? And then someone popped up in the chat feed and said, oh, they're just behind the microphone. I couldn't see them because they were behind the microphone. I said, but they could see them because that's where the camera was. And they popped up and said, oh, the scissors are just there. They're behind the microphone. I went, oh, thanks. And so we had a conversation. And so there's this unique relationship now where the audience expects and demands to be able to communicate with you, but on their terms. Now that is an inversion of what we as theatre makers have understood for 4,000 years, right? That is a complete and utter inversion of this. Yeah. This audience here was never expected to be able to talk to these people here, right? These people here were cloistered away behind the stage buildings, tucked away backstage, certain levels of authority and exclusivity and power, and they were tucked away. And these people, all these people, would watch them in a reverence with which they couldn't communicate and share with. Yeah? And if you did transgress that relationship of who was allowed to speak, where and when, then this is the reaction you would get. Online, streaming now, that has been completely inverted. This audience demands, expects, it is the nature of being engaged online that you can communicate. Eugene just did it then. Hey Euge, how are you, mate? Need to bring the screen up. Yeah, sorry, man. I'm DJing across all sorts of things at the moment, dancing like a DJ. But yeah, so they expect to be able to communicate. They don't have to, by any stretch of the imagination. You can just sit there and watch voyeuristically if you like, but you expect to be able to if and when you ever want to. Now that's difficult for a performance. How do you create a dramatic narrative in an online space that exists in its own timeline? So you have a dramatic narrative and a character arc that exists and must follow a journey, but must do so with the space to be able to let that audience in and communicate with you and participate in the journey. How do you keep control of your narrative when it could be disrupted at any time? There is the potential for disruption that is by an online audience to talk, and that can throw you. So how do you at once create something that allows that to happen? Because if you don't allow it to happen, the performance will fail. How do you maintain your dramatic narrative with that potential disruption? And yeah, it's complicated. Because what we found is that if you do, where we started was in this basic format, is that we put the camera on, we got the actors, and we performed something. And what we found is that we were replicating the traditional theatre version. It became like film. It became like, you were just watching something in a proscenium arch, and the proscenium arch is this little camera here. Yeah. And that alienated an audience. The performances failed. How did we do that? Well, can't give it all away in the first one, can I? You'll have to keep coming back to find out more. But it's a conundrum for actors and theatre makers of the future. And that's what I was getting back to last week in last week's stream. If you just film a theatre performance, even if you film it and broadcast it live, you're still maintaining that relationship of authority and space. Audience must watch, actors are allowed to speak, and neither the twain shall meet. And that's why it's not working online, because you may as well be watching a film. Also, those projects go through a lot of post-production, editing, angles, shots. We all know when we go to the theatre that what we love about it is the high wire act, is the fact that anything can happen, that it's dangerous, that it's live, that someone may trip or fall or stumble on a line. Now, if you were to do that in another version, you could edit that out and make it nice and clean. Well, that takes away some of that organic fissure of a live performance, doesn't it? So how do you maintain that? How do you maintain that live, visceral danger of live performance? How do you control it? Because it is fucking dangerous. I tell you, it is dangerous. When an audience starts to tweet back to you during a show, as the actor, you're obliged to acknowledge it and work with it, and yet maintain the narrative of the story, despite the fact that what the person online tweeting to you may take you completely off guard. The other aspect of it is, if you write a piece of performance that is dependent on audience interaction and dependent on that dialogue with an audience, and they don't talk to you, then what do? How do you get from point A to point B in your story when it's dependent on someone talking to you and they won't do it? That's what makes it dangerous. That's what makes it really scary. Now, there are a lot of different techniques that I've developed to figure out how to do that. And I think it's important as actors that we do figure out how to do that, because if we want to, as theatre makers, create work that is transformative, that is educational, that is abstract and surreal and imaginative, then we can't just do it in the bubble of being on stage anymore. We can't have that control of being in a bubble on stage. We have to open that bubble out, and we have to let people in who may or may not disrupt the process entirely, and we have to incorporate that potential disruption into the experience itself. So we have to control our lack of control. That's very hard, and I've spoken to other actors about this, and there's been quite a few actors who have basically said, I'm not interested. I don't think I can handle it. I don't want to perform to an audience who can talk back to me. I want them to sit and watch in my reverence. To watch with reverence my performance, to be engaged by this thing and this picture, and to go, ooh, that is wonderful. That is a craft. That is a work of art. That is a bowl. That is a piece of pottery. That's a painting that sits there, and I can sit there and admire it. As long as we maintained that distance that we have inherited through thousands of years of physical, spatial difference and division about who is allowed to speak and who is not allowed to speak, as long as we maintain that, we will not reach that audience. And that audience, and that is probably why, I mean, we can have a debate about this, but that is probably why, look, why is theatre dying? Is theatre dying? Theatre's not dying. Forget about it. It's not going to die. It'll never die. But it will diminish. And anyone who's been working in the theatre has noticed that. Audiences are getting smaller. It's harder and harder to get people to get off their ass, away from their couch, go into the theatre. Who the hell wants to get home from work at 6 o'clock at night, then travel 40 minutes into the city, pay for parking, pay for a ticket, watch a show, hopefully it's any good, get back out, cold rainy night, drive home again, blah, 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 when they can sit at home They can live stream anything they want to, or stream anything they want to. They can sit there on Instagram and they can talk to their idols and their heroes or each other. They can interact in so many different ways. As theatre makers who want to create those experiences that are transformative for an audience, then we have to respond to that. We have to figure out a way how we can do that. And we're not going to do that if we maintain the reverential distance between performer and audience. We have to include that audience as a vicarious co-performer. That it is a requirement of a live online performance that we acknowledge and invite those people we're performing to be a part of what we're doing at the potential risk of major disruption. How we manage and handle that disruption in such a way that doesn't alienate the audience from either feeling like they can be involved, or doesn't disrupt the process, the performance, so that it all falls apart and it doesn't work anyway. That's the trick. That's the key. That's the new dramaturgical language that web theatre has to try and navigate. It can be done, and it's quite exciting when it can be done. If we go back and look at Lunch with Jenna, there's heaps. Yeah, long-form improv. Absolutely. What you're describing is long-form improv. The audience performs. I can't see the rest of it there. Audience let me get you up. Where have you gone? Okay, let me go. That's what I mean. Yes, long-form improvisation has been huge. Absolutely. In fact, it was one of the techniques. Audience tells the performers what they want to see. Sometimes within the show, if they don't suggest anything, the actors have to keep creating the narrative themselves. Yes, absolutely true. And one of the acting techniques that we used was a character-based improvisation type work, which an advocate of that is Dr. Robert Marchand, where we had to create characters who lived in a role and sort of had a narrative that they were in, and that they maintained a journey towards the end. And yes, if the audience didn't respond, then they still had direction to go with. Certainly, and it feels structureless when you're writing that for an actor. It feels like they don't have the structure. And that, again, I think is a scary thing for some actors. When they want lines, they want to know where they're going from one point to the other. Isn't it a sign of respect, though? If I'm performing on a stage, which is my workplace, I don't expect someone to enter that workplace to plug in their phone or interact with the performers. I wouldn't accept that any more than an office worker would. Absolutely. No, you're totally right. Because there is this relationship between who's allowed to be in a certain space doing certain things at a certain time. And on stage, yeah, you're right. You're up there working in a particular space, and I'm observing that space from the outside in. I don't have the authority to be in that space. And it gets back to this idea that I was saying here in the original thing here, is that the nature of a space determines the authority with which you can act in it. The things you're allowed to do in it. If you're allowed to be in that space, you're allowed to be in the theatre, but you're not allowed to be on the stage. Space determines who is allowed to be there. It determines authority and those sorts of things. So yes, that's why those things. But what I'm getting at is that the space of online doesn't have that demarcation. Because being online, you are expected to be able to talk to me because I've invited you here. So how can I perform to you and invite you in and maintain that level of distance and respect in my working environment, at the same time requiring you to be in that space in my working environment. I tend to go around in circles. This is complex stuff, and trying to make it simple is a process. Just refreshing again. So, am I running around in circles? Probably a bit now. Have a bit of a think about that. Though, if space determines what you can do and what you can't do, if being in that space determines the journey, emotional or otherwise, or intellectual or otherwise, from point A to point B, if you deconstruct all of those rules of engagement, I mean, being online, you can have rules of engagement because you can have moderators and you can say, well, I'm not going to accept certain language. But then there's an argument to say, well, is that a point of censorship as well? That was a debate that we had quite a lot. Do I want to limit? Because that's the other thing too, you know, like if you're in an audience of a theatre and you find a joke that's funny, and you laugh loudly, you'll still get that look. Well, what are you laughing at? You know, well, there's that social contract that happens in an audience. We've all experienced as performers on stage where the audience is quiet, or they're uncomfortable, or they don't know whether they're allowed to laugh, or they don't, you know, that because they're working socially as a group together. But when you're online, you don't have that social group. You're sitting there wherever you are, Huge. You're sitting there on your own, I assume, and you're having a personal engagement with me. And there could be hundreds of people out there having a one-on-one engagement with me, absent from that social compact that happens around everyone. So everyone has a unique individual access point. Even though I'm performing to an aggregate group of people, I have a unique line of communication with each and every one of them. And each and every one of them has an expectation or an obligation to be contacting me. And yet the aggregate of people aren't aware of themselves, aren't aware of each other. You're not aware of all the other people that are watching. You don't have that kind of social monitoring of behaviour that adjusts. And that's why, you know, when you go on stage, every show is different, isn't it? Because every audience is different. Every audience is made up of different people, different states of mind, different emotional things, different, you know. But they all sort of moderate their behaviour into a group dynamic. But you don't have that group dynamic as an audience when you're working one-on-one directly, as I feed straight into whatever device you're watching me on. How sustainable is that disruption model? What is the long-term investment for the audience once they've had their fun, for want of a better word, and have interacted with and influenced the performance? Where do they go then? Who has the ultimate control? Very good question. Very good question. How sustainable is that disruption model? I think I'm getting closer to finding a version that is close. When I guess what you're saying, when you say sustainable, are you saying as a genre, or are you saying within a performance? I think within a performance, that's something that we're still developing. Each of the Lunch with Jenna performances we did went for about an hour. We found that an hour was a good length of time, because it gave the the concept and the model long enough to establish itself for the audience to drop into what was expected of them. And an hour felt like we were working on the premise that people sit and watch a TV show for an hour. They'll watch a movie for an hour and a half. Like the idea of sitting and watching and doing something like that, about an hour we kind of worked on. The disruption model, and this is where it gets tricky in managing that. So if it was just open-ended disruption model, it probably would have fallen over. So you have to write a piece that does have character arc and journey and does have those kind of fundamental things that you find in a play, your first, second, third act, your 3-act principle, those Aristotelian kind of principles of writing, still have to happen within the journey of that hour in order to make that a kind of piece that has a beginning, middle and end and a journey. The journey is a different thing again, because the nature of being online, there is no sort of happily ever after. There's just on to the next thing. So how do you wrap up a storyline and yet still maintain some semblance of that it's still going? Long-term investment for the audience once they've had their fun. Well, I think that's the other part of it, is that rather than just thinking about performing in a closed caption 1 hour, the nature of online relationships is that kind of serial model. That kind of one of the models we talked about was like the telenovela, or the Home and Away, or the EastEnders kind of thing, where there was just this kind of rolling narrative that just kept unfolding. If you follow anyone online, let's say you follow, Shane Dawson or Jeffree Star or something like that, you might have only just discovered Jeffree Star, and you might go online and follow his Twitter handle, and then you quickly realise that you're jumping into a narrative that has a backstory that you weren't necessarily aware of, but you can go back and look at it. So you can go back through time and you can look at previous tweets, and you can see how the narrative unfolded between Jeffrey and James Charles, that sort of blow up that they had a few months ago. Or Jeffrey might he might do things in a tweet or in where he's alluding to what's going to happen next. Stay tuned, got a big announcement coming up in the next week. As a genre, I guess this is where I'm getting at as a genre, is that the tools for storytelling are not just screen time, microphone, camera. The tools for storytelling now extend across these other platforms. So you can, when we created these characters, we started by we got the idea of a guy called Jeremy Gable in New York, I think that's his name, who was a writer, and what he did is he created characters and gave them each a Twitter handle, Jane and Mark and Peter, for example. And what he did was that every few days he would write a new line, especially from that character, on their handle. And then the other character would interact and talk to them as well. And so what you did as a follower of that thread, as an audience member, you were being entertained by this narrative that was unfolding only on Twitter. So we tried to follow that model. So we gave characters Twitter handles and Instagram handles. One, because Twitter is mainly text, and two, because Instagram is mainly visual. So it gave our characters the opportunity to do long-form improvisation on multiple different platform models. So the idea was that you worked towards, you followed the narrative, like you would follow people that you follow on Instagram, and you just follow their journey, and you invest in that character, and you follow them on their different platforms, and they have their ups and their downs and all the rest of it, and you can get invested in that. And what happened with Nikki's character, particularly Jenna, is that Nikki's character Jenna started to get a life of her own. Jenna got audience members who followed Jenna. Now, we made it quite clear, quite transparent, that Jenna was a character, kind of like a Dame Edna. Like, she was a character that lived and existed. Dame Edna has her own life. Dame Edna is completely separate from Barry Humphries in terms of their life and their journey. You can just follow Dame Edna, or you can just follow Barry Humphries, and never the two. You never see them in the same room at the same time, do you? So, as a genre, getting back to your question, as a genre, I think it's quite exciting in that you now have more mediums, you have more stages to play on. We can play on the stage where I'm talking to you and I'm projecting something on YouTube or Vimeo or whatever, but I also have the stage where I can be performing, or my characters can be performing via Twitter or Snapchat or Instagram, and that's where it sort of layers again, because those characters can talk to each other through those platforms, but those characters can talk to audience members directly through those platforms as well. So I think as a genre, who has the ultimate control? Well, I think you still have ultimate control as a writer. I mean, you have a story you want to tell. I'm working. I'm in the very early stages of a story at the moment that I want to tell about commercial content moderators. Basically, they're a invisible labour force of people who are responsible for content management. When communities flag inappropriate material on a platform, they're the ones that have to assess it and then pull it down. And it's quite it's invisible labour that's quite important. And these are the people who are looking at all the detritus of human content that gets uploaded. And there's quite a lot of psychological and emotional trauma that comes from that. So that's a story I want to tell. How do I want to tell it? There's going to be a performative aspect to it, definitely. But now I also feel like I have these other stages that I can use to perform. Twitter handles and Instagram posts and all these other things as well. I have these other stages. I have multiple stages. So I guess in terms of this space thing, rather than thinking of I'm here and you're there, it's kind of like there's layers of filters between the character and the story that's being told and the way that it's getting out there. It's a different way of conceiving it. I think the other thing about this particular model is that we have to think differently about the business model of it, because the internet and social media is a beast that just consumes content all the time. We have to think differently. Yes, we have to find a way of making an income, but I think that business model has to change with the way that we're presenting as well. Yes, you can have special events, but I think there's other ways that we have to consider, because there are one of the other things the internet has done is disrupted so many business models of conventional practice that we have to think differently about that as well. And look, I don't have all the answers. I just have, these are the things that I've discovered and the things that I'm trying to work through and codify and sort of narrow down into something. No one's doing this stuff yet. Well, it's happening in little bits and pieces. Like I said, there's the guy who wrote the Twitter plays, and they're great. If you've read it, go and have a look for them. They're pretty cool, but they are like reading a script. And you do have to. He hasn't written one for a while, and you do have to sort of be following those characters and constantly going back to Twitter and refreshing and going, what are they up to? What have they posted today? Sort of things like following celebrity, tapping into that idea of celebrity. But it is a discourse, a linguistic discourse kind of platform. It's like reading the script as it unfolds. They haven't had as much of the live engagement. There's another couple of companies in New York who have experimented with different aspects to it, and they've experimented with both the Twitter Play version and they took it to the next level, where those characters in the Twitter Play then communicated with each other like in a Skype chat, and that Skype chat was kind of broadcast, but again it was still two scripted actors performing, improvised around, but they were essentially performing. There wasn't the audience engagement. And then they took it to another level again, where those characters arranged to meet at a nightclub, and then the audience that were following them online were also invited to go to that nightclub and meet the characters in real life. And there was a bit of long-form improvisation involved with that as well. But it still kind of fell back into that us and them, where the actor's performing, you're the audience watching as that novelty. So there are companies who are working around it. There have been shows here in Adelaide where audiences have been allowed to vote, and that's kind of that improvisation model again, where you need the audience to give you offers that you can work with, and that so I think and if you want to look even further down the road, then there are things like augmented reality and virtual reality technologies, which are becoming cheaper and cheaper and more domesticated, and it won't be long before that stuff is just in your home. And there are uses, I think there are incredible untapped potential to incorporate some of this methodology of performing online and incorporating some of that technology as well. It's huge. It's really huge. I really do think I see a day where you could just be sitting at home, you could put on your really lightweight 3D glasses, and you could watch a holographic image of Pacino and Streep performing in Broadway on your table, like, that's real Star Wars kind of stuff. But that technology is coming down the pipeline. It's coming very quickly. There's no possible way I can anticipate how that will look, although I do believe that there is an opportunity. That's why I call it a new genre. It's a new genre of theatre. It's not the old genre of theatre and just supplanted online. It has got to be a version of performing that incorporates everything that is about living online. So, cool. Thanks for the questions, huge. What time have I got now? 11:07. All right, I'm going to wrap it there. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm going to be back in a couple of weeks with the next one. If you've got any suggestions, if you've got any questions for things you want me to answer specifically, like I say, I am working through this as I'm discovering it. I am working without a map in areas that haven't been thought of before. So if it comes across as a little bit like I'm working through it as we go, that's because I'm working through it as we go. And like all good explorations, the back and forth with other people, the questions that you have, the ideas that you've got. I'm not a font of all wisdom by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just trying to find my way. So, let's find our way together. Again, big shout out to my Patreon subscribers for this last week or 2 weeks. Awesome shout out to you. They are Tamara Lee, Wayne Groom, Kirsty Haigh, Dorothy Di Stefano. If you want to get involved, go to the Patreon page, which is patreon.com/MAPT4D. Go there. I'm starting to push and promote everything we do now through that page and align it with a couple of other sites, just to, so I'm not spreading everything all over the place, but I'm trying to align it. I'm going to use that Patreon page as a sort of notification center. There'll be posts. There's stuff that's there for patrons only. There's stuff that's there for public. In terms of getting back to that question you had about where is the future and the genre and the business model, I think that's another aspect to it as well. We can talk about that in another episode. So I'm going to wrap it there. Thank you again for joining me. It's been fun. I'm enjoying this. It's scary. It's unknown territory. But you know what? Fuck it. If you don't do anything that doesn't feel strange and new, then you'll just get stuck in the same old shit. And I've never been one for doing that. Okay, cool. I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you, linesman. Thank you, ball boys. It's been fun. I will see you all